Hi everybody, so this video is going to go over our Chapter 16, Section 3 notes. I'm going to go over all of the important parts of Chapter 16, Section 3, and then we'll all go over the 5 questions at the end that make up your assignment. By the way, if you haven't finished watching our movie, Selma, I would suggest you go and finish that movie first and then come back and finish watching this video because I'm going to be talking about that movie while I go through here, so you're going to want to have finished it before you watch these notes. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1869, right after the Civil War, and it originally gave all African Americans, African American men, the right to vote. Women wouldn't get the vote until later on in the early 1900s. Women actually got the right to vote in 1919, but in 1869, all men, including African Americans, were given the right to vote. However, while this was the law on the books, this is not what generally happened in practice. Um, African Americans were widely refused the right to vote through certain tactics such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. So poll taxes just simply meant that you had to pay money to vote, and many African Americans at this time were very poor, and they could not afford the poll tax to vote. Literacy tests, it isn't exactly what it sounds. It's not just you had to know how to read. The test could be absolutely anything. We saw in the movie the character that was actually played by Oprah Winfrey went to try to vote, and the person at the office asked her how many judges are there in the state of Alabama, and she somehow correctly said 67. And then he asked her to name them all. And I mean, nobody could do that. I'm sure those 67 judges themselves couldn't name all 67 judges in Alabama. So that denied her the right to vote. So that would be an example of a literacy test. So it wasn't just simply can you read. The test could have literally anything on it. And then intimidation. That just meant putting a bunch of clans members with guns standing out in front of the polling place just to scare people off from voting. So unfortunately, a lot of these things are still going on today in different forms. And this is something that African American civil rights workers are all trying to combat against. All right, so the March to Selma. This is basically what that entire movie that we watched was about. Was about the marches that went from Selma to Birmingham. Martin Luther King was one of the main people who organized these marches, although we did see in the movie that he actually was not present during the first march. His organization decided that they didn't want all of their leaders to be at the march because there was a great chance that everyone at the march was going to be arrested, possibly killed, and they didn't want to lose of their leaders, all on the same day. So they drew straws in the movie. I don't know if that's exactly how they decided in real life, but that is how they showed it in the movie. And just the one who drew the short straw was the one who went on that march. So Martin Luther King stayed behind for that first march. That first march is what became known as Bloody Sunday. They brought the horses in, and everyone just got beat by the Alabama National Guard. It was a horrible incident in our country's history, but definitely an incident that we need to know about and remember. So what eventually came out of that march was the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The worst part for the racist people who were trying to prevent African Americans from voting was that the entire thing was shown on national television. There were reporters there were news agencies there, and they caught the whole thing and that let all of the non-racist white people around the country all of a sudden have their eyes open to what was actually going on. So they all joined the fight, and that put pressure on President Johnson to finally do something about this, and that led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This allowed the banning of poll taxes. They decided that was illegal. Literacy tests were now illegal, and allowed the federal government to oversee elections. Before this, voting was 100% on the states themselves. The federal government was not allowed to step in and do anything, even when the states were doing racist and unfair voting practices. Nowadays, there's a little more oversight. Voting is still mostly controlled by the states themselves, but the federal government, especially when there's issues of discrimination involved, the federal government is now allowed to step in and actually do something about it. So in the movie, we did see a little bit of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. They were just another organization that fought for African American rights and for voting rights and ending segregation and all the things that were going on in the 60s. They agreed with Martin Luther King's goals. They wanted all the same things, but they did not always agree on methods. So the Black Panthers were a much more militant organization. They were willing to take their rights by force. They didn't always agree with Martin Luther King's nonviolent methods. And they had a point in the fact that the other side was certainly not being nonviolent, and they felt they should fight back by force. One thing that is often forgotten about the Black Panthers is that they weren't just this crazy militant organization running around with guns and causing violence. They were also kind of a grassroots movement. They were in the neighborhoods, they were doing food drives, and they were really doing a lot to help, especially the poorer members of the African American community. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King is in Memphis, and he's going to aid the striking sanitation workers. Sanitation workers were being discriminated against. They had many unfair practices against them, and they were on strike. And King went down there, and he was going to just show support for them. While he was standing on a hotel balcony, he is shot from a building across the street. His death kind of marked a turning point for the civil rights movement for many different reasons, one of which, obviously, if they lose their main leader, that's going to slow down the process a little bit. They had made some great accomplishments at that point with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so things did kind of slow down for that. But another reason was a lot of the country's attention was actually being moved to the Vietnam War. Before this, especially after Bloody Selma, or Bloody Sunday, from the March on Selma, a lot of the attention of the country was put on civil rights, and then at this point in 1968, a lot of that attention was moving to protesting the Vietnam War. So 2 more things to talk about. Number 1, affirmative action. Affirmative action is still a thing that's talked about today. It was the first parts of it was put into place around this time. It's going to set a minimum number of minorities who need to be present in schools and businesses. It was meant to close the economic gap between blacks and whites. So what this meant is if you owned a business, and especially if it's in a black community, if you had 10 employees, let's say 2 or 3 of them would have to be African Americans. We'll see this in especially like Major League Baseball today. You'll see certain things about it. If a new head coach job is open on a team in the league, a lot of times it says that they have to interview at least 2 African American candidates for that job. And, a lot of this is a little controversial. It's a lot of, you might hear the words reverse racism, which seems like a good idea in practice, but it doesn't always work how it's meant. Personally, in my personal opinion on affirmative action, I believe it is kind of a necessary thing, but that it's sad that it's necessary. It shouldn't be necessary. Everyone should just simply hire the people who are best fit for the job, regardless of what color they are. But since that doesn't happen, African Americans consistently get looked over for jobs and for positions that they are most deserving of. Uh, so, because of all that, affirmative action does tend to be necessary. All right, last thing to talk about here before we get to our assignment is the Kerner Commission. So, in the mid to late 60s, there were many race riots that broke out all over the country. Watts and Newark and Detroit were the most well-known ones, but there were many all over the rest of the country. President Johnson appointed a man named Otto Kerner to investigate. And all of the crazy racist white people all just assumed that Kerner was going to come back. But Kerner did not actually blame the people who were rioting like many people expected him to. He actually blamed all of the extreme discriminatory policies that were in place at the time that led to the riots. We could actually make a connection to today. We just recently in the last year, we've seen some riots break out, a lot of mass protests, some of which have turned a little violent. And if Kerner looked at what's happened in the world in the last year, he would probably have the same opinion that you can't necessarily blame the people who are rioting for that. It was all of the things that led to that. When people are being murdered in the streets by racist police officers, how do you really expect others to react to that? So you can't blame them for those actions as much as you can blame the things that led to them taking those actions. And that would, of course, be all of the discriminatory policies that were in place then and the ones that still are in place now that are continuing to try to discriminate and disenfranchise people. All right, so that brings us to our assignment here. I do want to go through these questions and give you a little idea about how you should answer each of these. I have talked about each of these things throughout the video, but number one says, explain how Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination marked a turning point for the civil rights movement. I talked about that. There were a lot of different things that resulted in number one, just the fact that they lost their main leader is going to kind of put an end to that movement, and then the fact that a lot of the nation's attention was actually moving on to protesting the Vietnam War as opposed to protesting the civil rights. Number two says, discuss the reasoning behind affirmative action and compare it with criticisms of the policy. So when you answer this, make sure that you do both of those things. Discuss the reasoning behind it. Obviously, that's just because African Americans were being passed up on many job opportunities, and it made it necessary. But compare that with the criticisms. The criticisms is, that whole reverse racism thing that now we're hiring people because they're African American. So is that any better than not hiring them because they're African American? Either way, you're hiring based on race. So, they do have a point in that respect. But, if the systematic racism didn't exist to begin with, then affirmative action just wouldn't even be necessary at all. Number three says, describe the events that led to President Johnson's call for federal voting legislation in 1965. Obviously, Bloody Sunday was the main event that led to that, but there were some others. So if you could name some other things, that would be great as well. Compare and contrast the efforts Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panthers to reform economic injustice. Make sure on this one that you compare and contrast. You just don't do one and not the other. So they were similar in many ways. They were fighting for the same things. It would be the main one. And then the biggest difference between the two is Martin Luther King Jr. Had his nonviolence practices, and the Black Panthers didn't mind using violence when they felt it was necessary. And then number five, what I just got done talking about on the last slide, discuss the conclusions of the Kerner Commission and explain why many people found it controversial. So I mentioned the actual conclusion was that it was the systematic racism and the discriminatory policies that led to these riots, and that the blame shouldn't be placed on the rioters themselves. And that's controversial in a few ways. A lot of people would like to blame the rioters for their actions. Uh, Mostly it was the racist white people at the time that just wanted to blame the black people for what they were doing and didn't want to take any of the blame for themselves. And Kerner basically said that that was not the case. All right, so that is the end of 16.3. Make sure you finish up this assignment. Make sure you write all of these answers in complete sentences, and I will see you on the next one.